Get out. Now. You are not welcome here. Someone call security and remove this woman. The manager's voice detonated in the pristine air of the luxury car dealership, an explosion of sound that echoed off the polished marble and chrome. His face was a mask of crimson rage, veins standing out on his neck like cords as he screamed at a black woman dressed in simple, casual clothes. The tension in the showroom was a palpable thing, thick enough to suffocate. This was Brad Wilson, and he had lost all semblance of control. Customers stood frozen, their mouths agape. Employees were statues at their desks, but the woman at the center of the storm, she stood with a calmness that was utterly chilling. Her name was Zora, and when she spoke, her voice was like ice. You have no idea what you just did. There was no shouting in her reply, no hysteria. Just a quiet, controlled fury more terrifying than any scream. The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat. A line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The woman was Zora Thompson. At 42, she was the architect of one of America's most formidable automotive empires, a dynasty she had built from nothing. A self-made millionaire, she owned not one, not five, but 12 luxury car dealerships across the state. The Thompson Automotive Group was her life's work, and on that day, she was watching her own employees tear down everything she had built it upon. She had recently acquired this very dealership, Prestige Motors of Beverly Hills, the newest and most expensive jewel in her corporate crown. This was no ordinary showroom. It was a playground for Hollywood royalty, tech billionaires, and old money scions, a place where six-figure price tags were treated as pocket change. But unsettling whispers had reached Zora's ears, rumors that coiled in her stomach like a cold serpent. Former customers spoke of being treated differently, judged by the clothes they wore, the car they drove, or the color of their skin. These weren't loud complaints, but subtle, insidious stories that suggested a deep sickness in the culture of her new acquisition. So, Zora devised a plan, one as audacious as it was perilous. She was going to test her own people. Not with a corporate inspection, announced and sterile, but with something real, something raw. She would go undercover. The idea was a world away from her reality. Zora Thompson commanded respect the moment she entered a room. Her daily armor consisted of $1,000 business suits and jewelry that captured the light. Her presence alone announced success. But not today. Today, she delved into the back of her cavernous closet, retrieving relics from a past life. Old blue jeans, worn thin at the knees, a pair of faded sneakers, a simple t-shirt that looked plucked from a bargain bin. Staring at her reflection, she saw a stranger. The polished CEO had vanished, replaced by a woman who looked as if she were struggling to make her way in the world. The risks were monumental. This was not a matter of bruised egos or a poor review. If her suspicions were true, if her employees were actively discriminating against customers, it could shatter her empire. The Thompson brand was built on a foundation of integrity. Even a hint of prejudice could trigger lawsuits, boycotts, and the utter ruin of a reputation she had spent decades building. But she had to know the truth, no matter how painful. For the final touch of her disguise, she made a crucial choice. She bypassed the Bentley she took to board meetings, the Tesla she drove around town, and the classic Mustang she cherished on weekends. Instead, she chose her 2015 Honda Civic. It was a reliable, practical car. But pulling up to Prestige Motors, where the cheapest vehicle cost more than an annual salary, the 9-year-old Civic was a silent declaration that its driver did not belong. And that was precisely the point. As Zora parked her modest car and walked toward the gleaming glass doors, she was no longer a CEO. She was a test. And her employees had no idea they were about to be judged by the very woman who signed their paychecks. The moment she stepped inside, her worst fears were about to become a horrifying reality. The next 20 minutes would not only shock her to her core, but prove that the people you trust most can betray everything you stand for. The showroom was a cathedral of wealth. Polished marble floors reflected the light from massive crystal chandeliers. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Rolls-Royces were displayed like priceless jewels. The air itself seemed to hum with exclusivity. But as Zora stepped inside, cloaked in her disguise of worn jeans and old sneakers, it was as if she had ceased to exist. 3 salespeople were on the floor, lavishing attention on other customers, laughing at their jokes, offering them coffee, treating them like royalty. Zora stood adrift in the opulent space for 3 entire minutes. Salespeople walked past her, their eyes sliding over her as if she were part of the furniture. The disregard was so absolute, it was breathtaking. Finally, she approached the reception desk where a young woman named Jessica sat, a vision of curated perfection. Perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, an outfit that cost a month's rent. Jessica typed on her computer, fully aware of Zora's presence, but refused to look up. After a long minute, she finally raised her eyes, her expression a mask of pure condescension. "If you're here about a job, applications are online," she said, her tone as cold and hard as the marble floor. No greeting, no offer of help, just an immediate, insulting assumption. Zora owned this building, she employed this woman, yet she was being dismissed as a job seeker. Maintaining her composure, Zora replied politely, "I'm interested in looking at cars." Jessica's eyes scanned Zora from head to toe, a slow, contemptuous appraisal. Her voice, syrupy with condescension, dripped out the words. "Honey, our cheapest car is $40,000. Maybe you should try the used lot down the street." The audacity was stunning. But before Zora could process the insult, things escalated. Brad Wilson, the manager, strode across the showroom. 38 years old with slicked back hair and a suit that screamed ambition, he carried himself with an air of unearned superiority. He had made a career of fawning over the rich while scorning everyone else. He approached with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." He didn't introduce himself, he didn't welcome her, he simply implied her very presence was a mistake. Zora held her ground. "I'd like to see your luxury sedans." This is where Brad's pretense of civility dissolved. "Those require serious buyers," he said, his voice laced with insinuation, "with pre-approved financing." He was demanding proof of wealth from a woman who had merely asked a look at a car. Other customers began to watch, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The humiliation was public, a deliberate performance designed to drive her out. Brad was putting on a show for his real clients, demonstrating that he protected their exclusive sanctuary. But Zora wouldn't be moved. She walked over to a stunning black BMW sedan, its $85,000 price tag gleaming under the lights. She ran a hand along its flawless finish, admiring the craftsmanship. That was when Brad lost his temper. He stormed over, his face a thundercloud. "I'm going to need to see 3 forms of identification and recent bank statements before we can discuss this vehicle," he boomed, his voice loud enough for the entire showroom to hear. He then waved over the security guard, a large man named Tom, as if Zora were a threat. "Just in case," Brad said loudly, the message clear. She was being treated like a criminal. Just then, the glass doors opened again. A well-dressed white man entered, and the atmosphere in the dealership shifted instantly. It was like a switch had been flipped. Jessica, the receptionist, was suddenly all warmth and smiles. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Prestige Motors." A salesperson who had ignored Zora completely rushed over to offer the new arrival coffee and a tour. Zora watched, her jaw tightening, as the brutal double standard played out before her. The new customer expressed interest in the very same BMW. Without hesitation, the salesperson scrambled to get the keys, eager to let this serious buyer take it for a test drive. No questions asked, no ID required, no security guard hovering nearby. Brad turned back to Zora, his fake smile back in place. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of our other locations." He paused, letting the unspoken insult hang in the air. He was telling her to go where her kind belonged. It was in that moment that 30 years of work, of building a business on the principles of respect and equality, came crashing down. She was watching her own employees betray everything she believed in. And then, Tom, the security guard, made the worst mistake of his life. He lunged forward and grabbed Zora's arm. "Come on, lady, time to go." The grip was aggressive, a final, physical insult. With surprising strength, Zora wrenched her arm free. "Take your hands off me," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that stopped everyone cold. "I will walk out myself." As she reached the door, Brad delivered what he thought was the final blow, his voice dripping with smug triumph. "And don't come back unless you can afford to shop here." Zora paused in the doorway and slowly turned, For the first time, a smile spread across her face, but it held no warmth. It was the calm before a hurricane, a chilling promise of the reckoning to come. "Oh," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I'll be back, very soon." She walked out, leaving a stunned and silent dealership in her wake. In the solitude of her Honda Civic, Zora finally allowed the tremors to begin, her hands shaking not with fear, but with a pure, concentrated rage. She took out her phone. Her first call was to her assistant Sarah. Her voice, when she spoke, was a blade of ice. "Sarah, the test. They failed, spectacularly." This wasn't poor training. This was a deep, institutional rot. "Prepare the termination paperwork," she ordered. The words were a death sentence for careers, the first swing of the axe that would bring this toxic culture crashing down. Then as she sat there, processing the depth of the betrayal, she looked through the showroom window. Another customer was walking in. It was a young black woman in her late 20s, dressed in a sharp business suit, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her success. She was the ideal customer, the very future Zora had built her company to serve. And as Zora watched her step through those doors, her heart sank. She knew exactly what was about to happen. But Zora knew that appearances were the only currency that mattered inside Prestige Motors. And she was right. From her vantage point across the parking lot, she watched in cold horror as the exact same sickening pattern began to unfold. Jessica, the receptionist who had treated Zora like an inconvenience, barely glanced up as Jennifer approached. The same salespeople who had pointedly ignored Zora continued their conversations, acting as if Jennifer were invisible. Then it got worse. So much worse. Zora's stomach tightened as she saw Brad Wilson spot Jennifer, his face contorting into that same predatory smile, that same mask of condescending charm. She was too far away to hear the words, but she didn't need to. The body language was a brutal, silent film telling the entire story. The dismissive hand gestures, the patronizing tilt of his head. It was the same systematic humiliation he had subjected Zora to just minutes before. And in that moment, the truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't personal. It was policy. This wasn't one bad employee on a bad day. This was an institutional sickness, a rot that had festered in her own dealership, completely beneath her notice. Jennifer was being forced through the same degrading gauntlet. The invasive demands for identification, the skeptical questions about financing, the subtle suggestions that she might be more comfortable elsewhere. It was a recurring nightmare, playing out in real time. Zora scanned the showroom. She saw the other customers, the well-dressed, the outwardly affluent, being treated with fawning respect. The double standard wasn't just blatant. It was a well-oiled machine, one that had likely been running for months, perhaps years. Something inside Zora snapped. This was no longer about business. It was about basic human dignity. It was about every young professional like Jennifer who had walked through those doors hoping to celebrate their success, only to be told in 1,000 unspoken ways that they did not belong. It was about every customer judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin. Quietly, she raised her phone and began to record. She documented every dismissive glance, every disrespectful gesture, building a case for the reckoning to come. But then, she did something more. Something that would escalate the situation beyond anything Brad Wilson could ever imagine. She sent a text message, just 8 words, but they were a declaration of war. "It's worse than we thought. Initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7. The name alone should have sent a tremor of fear through anyone in the Thompson Automotive Group. It was the nuclear option, the last resort Zora had prayed she would never have to use. A protocol reserved for crises so damaging that they required immediate, decisive action from the highest level. Within moments, her phone began to vibrate. Her legal team, human resources, regional managers, they all knew what Protocol 7 meant. They were mobilizing for what was about to become the most dramatic corporate house cleaning in the company's history. Then she made another call, one that should have made Brad Wilson's blood run cold. "Get the regional manager on the line. Tell him it's urgent." Not a local supervisor, the regional manager, the man who oversaw entire districts, whose decisions could reshape the company's landscape. Zora wasn't playing games. She was calling in the artillery. After 15 minutes of quiet, intense calls, Zora vanished. She drove away in her modest Honda, leaving the staff inside to believe they had won, that they had successfully defended their pristine showroom from an unworthy intruder. Brad probably felt a surge of smug satisfaction, perhaps even regaling his colleagues with the tale of how he'd handled the difficult customer. But half an hour later, a figure approached the dealership's entrance, and this time everything was different. The person who walked through those glass doors wore a perfectly tailored business suit that cost more than most of the cars on the floor. The shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. The jewelry was subtle, but its value was unmistakable. Everything about this person radiated success, authority, and power. It was Zora, but it was a Zora they had never seen. Gone was the woman in faded jeans and sneakers. In her place stood someone who looked as if she could buy the entire dealership on a whim. The confidence in her stride, the quiet command in her posture, this was not the woman they had thrown out less than an hour ago. When she spoke, her voice had changed too. Gone was the polite, patient tone of a hopeful customer. This was the voice of boardrooms and hostile takeovers, the voice of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands. It was the voice of power, and it was about to shatter the foundations of Brad's world. "I'd like to speak with your district manager," Zora said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Brad looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but his arrogance quickly extinguished it. He couldn't connect the woman he had just humiliated with this vision of corporate power standing before him. "Look, lady," he sighed, the dismissive tone dripping from his voice. "I thought we settled this. You can't just keep coming back here." He still had no idea what he was dealing with. He thought a change of clothes was a desperate tactic to earn his respect. He was about to receive a lesson in consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Zora simply looked at him, a faint, chilling smile playing on her lips. "Tell him Zora is here." Brad's confusion was plain. "Zora who?" "Listen, if you don't leave, I'm calling the police." But instead of reacting, Zora's smile widened. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that signaled the coming of a storm. "He'll know," she said, and those two words held more certainty than anything Brad had ever known. Seconds later, the district manager, Robert Chen, burst through the glass doors as if his life depended on it. This was a man who managed million-dollar operations, a man accustomed to high-pressure situations. But right now, he looked like a man staring into an abyss. He was practically sprinting across the marble floor, his expensive suit rumpled, sweat beading on his forehead despite the showroom's cool air. His eyes darted around frantically until they landed on Zora. And then, something incredible happened. Robert Chen, the powerful district manager, went ghost white. The color drained from his face as if he'd just seen his worst nightmare made real. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, in a voice trembling with a mixture of terror and reverence, he stammered, "Miss Thompson, I had no idea you were—" But before he could finish, Brad Wilson made the single greatest mistake of his life. He interrupted his boss's boss with an arrogance so profound it was breathtaking. "Thompson? Wait, how do you know this troublemaker?" He had just called the woman his district manager was terrified of a troublemaker. It was in that moment that the pieces began to click into place for anyone paying attention. The phone calls, the sudden shift in power, the name, Thompson. In the automotive industry, that name should have commanded respect. It should have inspired fear. Robert Chen looked as if he wanted the marble floor to swallow him whole. He was watching his own career burn to the ground. His voice was a weak tremor as he tried to intervene, but it was far too late. Then Zora spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a shard of ice. She wasn't yelling. She spoke with a quiet authority that silenced the entire room. "Robert," she said calmly, "I'd like you to observe how your staff treats potential customers." The terror in Robert Chen's eyes was absolute. He understood now. This had been a test, a secret audit, and they had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. But Zora wasn't finished with Brad. She was going to give him one last shovel to dig his own grave. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm still interested in that BMW." It was a final test, a chance, however slim, to show a shred of decency, to prove that his behavior was a mistake, not a core belief. But Brad Wilson, even with his district manager wilting beside him, even with every warning sign flashing red, still didn't get it. His response confirmed that the poison ran deep. "Ma'am, after your behavior earlier," he began, the audacity of his words sucking the air from the room. He was about to blame her. Zora cut him off. 3 words, delivered with cold, surgical precision, that should make every discriminatory manager in America break out in a sweat. "My behavior?" She paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. "Let's talk about behavior." With the calm, deliberate motion of someone about to detonate a bomb, Zora Thompson reached into her jacket. Her fingers closed around a small, simple business card. She placed it on the counter between them. The soft click echoed through the silent showroom like a gunshot. "I'm Zora Thompson," she said, her voice steady, calm, and utterly terrifying. "CEO of the Thompson Automotive Group." The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation, every movement ceased. The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. CEO. The woman they had humiliated, belittled, and physically removed from the premises was the head of their entire company. But Zora was just getting started. "I own this dealership," she continued, each word a hammer blow, "and all 12 other locations in this state." The shock on their faces was a masterpiece of horror. Jessica, the receptionist, looked like she'd been struck by lightning, her mouth hanging open. The salesmen who had ignored her were frozen like statues, their minds no doubt replaying every customer they had ever dismissed. Tom, the security guard who had laid his hands on her, looked as if he wanted to simply cease to exist. His career wasn't just over, it was a cautionary tale. But the most devastating reaction belonged to Brad Wilson. The world of the man who had demanded her ID, questioned her finances, and had her thrown out, was crumbling around him in real time. But you can't be," he stammered, his voice shaking. He was trying to deny a reality his prejudiced mind couldn't process. Zora's response was the most powerful comeback he would ever hear. She looked him dead in the eye. "What? I can't be successful? I can't own a business?" The words, so eerily similar to his own condescending questions, struck him like a physical blow. He was forced to confront the ugly, racist foundation of his every action. His belief that a black woman couldn't possibly be wealthy, couldn't possibly be powerful, couldn't possibly be his boss. The irony was as perfect as it was brutal. Zora then turned to address the entire staff, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. "For the past hour, I've experienced the worst customer service of my life," she began. "But more importantly, I've witnessed a culture of discrimination that goes against everything this company stands for." Shame washed over the faces in the room, but for most of them, it was far too late. Brad made one last, desperate attempt to save himself, his voice cracking with panic. "Ma'am, if I had known who you were—" Zora cut him off, her voice low and final, delivering the words that would end his career and redefine her company forever. "That," she said, "is exactly the problem. Your respect shouldn't depend on who you think I am." The words hung in the air, a simple sentence holding the weight of a profound truth. A truth about dignity, about ethics, about the very fabric of human decency. In that moment, Brad had unknowingly confessed his own moral failing. He admitted, in essence, that had he known Zora's name, her title, her power, his demeanor would have been entirely different. He would have offered respect not as a right, but as a tribute to her status. And in doing so, he missed the entire point. True professionalism, true decency, is not reserved for the powerful. It is a baseline offered to all. The doors of a business should open into a space where the homeless person seeking shelter is met with the same fundamental dignity as the millionaire looking to spend a fortune. The teenager clutching savings for a first car deserves the same courtesy as the celebrity buying their 10th. This wasn't merely a lapse in business strategy, it was a failure of the human spirit. And Brad Wilson had just failed on both counts. The retribution was not just swift, it was a force of nature. It was decisive, efficient, and in its cold precision, utterly brutal. Zora Thompson had not forged a multi-million-dollar empire on wishful thinking or second chances for those who betrayed her core principles. She was living proof that actions at every level of an organization have consequences. Brad Wilson, The haughty manager who saw himself as the gatekeeper of an exclusive kingdom was the first to fall. He wasn't suspended. He wasn't given a warning or sent to a remedial course. He was fired, on the spot. The words were simple, but they were a death sentence for his career. "Pack your things, get out." In an instant, his world crumbled. His reputation, so carefully curated, was now ash. The superiority he wore like a fine suit was stripped away, revealing a hollow illusion built on the flimsy foundations of prejudice. The look on his face, a cocktail of disbelief, panic, and dawning horror, was a portrait of a man realizing his bigotry had cost him everything. He, who had thought himself untouchable, was learning that the real world does not bow to such petty tyrants. The shockwave continued outward. Jessica, the receptionist whose condescending smirk had been Zora's first welcome, soon learned the true price of her prejudice. As she was dismissed, she faced the stark reality that her smug dismissal of a customer was not a minor infraction but a career-ending catastrophe. Word travels fast in the world of luxury retail, and the story of why she was fired would follow her like a shadow, closing doors before she could even knock. Then came Tom, the security guard. The man who had put his hands on Zora, escorting her out as if she were a common criminal. He learned a harsh lesson that day. Just following orders is never a shield for injustice. His immediate termination was only the beginning. With a formal complaint filed, his security license would be under review, his actions scrutinized for violating a citizen's civil rights. For a moment of misguided obedience, his career was likely over. But what happened next is what separated Zora Thompson from a mere executive and defined her as a true leader. Punishment was only the beginning, it was not the goal. She could have made an example of the 3 employees and walked away, her point brutally made. But Zora saw this ugly incident not as an ending, but as a beginning. She used its painful clarity as a catalyst for foundational change. She announced a complete cultural overhaul of the dealership, effective immediately. Every single employee would undergo mandatory, ongoing diversity and sensitivity training. This wouldn't be a one-time seminar with stale coffee. It would be a deep, continuous education led by outside experts designed to root out unconscious bias and instill a profound respect for every customer. Hiring practices were to be rebuilt from the ground up, prioritizing character, empathy, and integrity over a polished resume. New protocols were established to guarantee that the person arriving in a dusty pickup truck received the exact same gracious welcome as the one stepping out of a Rolls-Royce. These weren't measures to avoid lawsuits or bad press. They were the architectural blueprints for a business that would reflect the unshakable values she'd learned as a girl of 12, working in her uncle's Detroit garage. Values of hard work, fairness, and human dignity. And then, in an act that revealed the true depth of her character, Zora turned her attention from punishment to restoration. Her memory returned to the other victim of the day's prejudice, Jennifer, the young black professional who had come to celebrate a milestone, only to be met with the same quiet humiliation Zora had faced. Zora sought her out. She found Jennifer still in the showroom, adrift in a sea of confusion and hurt. Zora didn't just offer a corporate form letter. She looked Jennifer in the eye and offered a heartfelt apology, woman to woman. She acknowledged the disrespect Jennifer had been shown and promised it would never happen again. Then, she went a step further. The very BMW Jennifer had been admiring was offered to her at a substantial discount. This wasn't a sales tactic. It was an act of restitution. It was a tangible acknowledgement that Jennifer's time had been devalued, her excitement soured, and her dignity assaulted by people unworthy of the company name. Jennifer's expression shifted from stunned silence to a wave of grateful relief. In that moment, she drove away not just with the car of her dreams, but with the powerful reassurance that injustice doesn't always have the final word. But the day's most profound moment was yet to come. Zora Thompson gathered the remaining staff and lingering customers. Her voice, calm but resonant, filled the now silent showroom. "Judge people," she said, "by their character, not their appearance." Those words echoed beyond the polished floors and chrome finishes, a simple creed for a complicated world. In a society so often fixated on the superficial, Zora had delivered a masterclass in what truly defines a person. Character, she demonstrated, is not a label we wear. It is revealed in the choices we make, and most critically, in how we treat others when we believe no one of consequence is watching. Brad Wilson had been weighed and measured by his character, and he had been found wanting. His choices, to belittle, to discriminate, to abuse his sliver of power, had authored his own downfall. Zora, too, had been judged by her character. Her composure, her resolve, and her commitment to building something better revealed a character that had not only forged an empire, but would ensure its legacy. This was never just a story about a rude manager getting his comeuppance. It was a lesson in the immense responsibility that comes with power, and a stark reminder of the consequences that follow when we allow prejudice to flourish. Zora Thompson had entered that showroom to test the character of her employees. She walked out having given a masterclass in leadership, justice, and the inviolable right of every person to be treated with respect. And Brad Wilson? He walked out with nothing but the bitter knowledge that his own ignorance had incinerated the life he'd built. He learned, in the harshest way imaginable, that character is destiny. Sometimes karma arrives quietly, disguised as a simple consequence. And sometimes, if you are truly unlucky, it arrives in the form of the very person you chose to dismiss, the person who holds your entire world in their hands. The ultimate lesson is not one of business, but of life itself. It's about the person you choose to be when you think the cameras are off. Because the truth, as Brad Wilson learned far too late, is that someone is always watching. And often, that someone is the most important person of all. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and share this video with others so they too can learn the power of character.